Transgenderism is a topic that I don't find very interesting philosophically, but there is at least one fundamental tenet of transgenderism that has gotten under my skin, so I need to scratch my itch. According to the Human Rights Campaign, a transgender person is one, and here let me quote exactly, whose sex assigned at birth is different from who they know they are on the inside. End of quote. As Princeton philosopher Robert George has written, today's trans activists hold an understanding of the human being and anthropology that sharply divides the material or body on the one hand and the spiritual or mental on the other. And more than that, they posit that the mind is superior to the body, a radical but logical extension of René Descartes' I think, therefore I am. I might disagree slightly with Professor George's characterization that the trans activists believe that the mind is superior to the body. I might have said that they believe that the mind is sovereign over the body, as a rower directs a rowboat. I think that the quotation from Professor George correctly identifies the crux of the problem here. It's historically known in philosophy as dualism. In the history of thought about mind and brain, or body and soul, Plato and Descartes are the outstanding psychophysical dualists. They assert that mankind is constituted by two utterly distinct and existentially separate substances. In the case of Plato, it was body and soul. For Descartes, it was matter and mind. In other words, between extended substance and thinking substance. For Descartes, brain and mind are not synonymous and actually have no connection of any kind. The brain, after all, is a material object while mind is not. Descartes says that a human being is not what our common sense supposes that a person is, one indivisible thing. That person is actually divided into two individual things as different and distinct as that rower and the rowboat in which he sits. As one commentator has put it, the thinking substance is a mind trapped in the wrong body. This is essentially the claim being made by transgender activists. If this dualistic theory were true, then the transgender activists would be confronted with some most embarrassing and I think insoluble problems. For example, how would they explain how these two utterly different and unconnected substances interact with one another as they definitely appear to do in human behavior? Fortunately, the riddles of the mind-body problem that have plagued modern philosophy since Descartes can be jettisoned, but that will also carry a core tenet of transgenderism along with it. Two incontrovertible facts, which are matters of general knowledge, refute psychophysical dualism completely. In other words, transgenderism, as argued by the trans activists themselves, is self-refuting. Let's look at the first one. We know that every human being falls asleep from time to time. For some portion of the time when we're asleep, our minds are totally inactive. We are unconscious. Furthermore, we know that sleep is induced by physical fatigue toxins that affect the brain. Of course, it can also be done by drugs of various sorts. But if, as the transgender activists assert, the mind is totally independent of the brain, then why should one brain condition allow for consciousness and another bring about unconscious sleep? The activists appear to offer no answer to this dilemma. Let's look at a second fact that refutes transgender dualism. As we all know, brain injuries or defects produce mental disabilities or disorders of various kinds. The medical literature contains numerous reports from neurological surgery that discuss how electrical stimulation of the brain can produce conscious experiences. How can this be so if mind and brain are as separate as the rower in the rowboat, as the transgender activists claim? In fact, they claim that the separation is so complete that apparently it permits the rowboat to be sunk while the rower can swim away unharmed. In the end, a fundamental tenet of transgenderism fails completely. Psychophysical dualism was pretty thoroughly shown to be erroneous long before the transgender activists retrieved it from the philosophical boneyard. This fundamental tenet of transgenderism appears to rest on nothing but ancient errors, errors which were explicitly acknowledged and avoided in earlier times. So all transgenderism does is throw in a few additional modern errors. Were the trans activists to acknowledge a connection between brain and mind, it would open up transgenderism to the possibility that it is a disorder of the body of some sort, and that's the last thing the activist appears to want. Dualism is an extremist view of the human intellect. In my view, it's easily proven to be an erroneous one as well. Dualism's opposite is known as monism. It also is an extremist view in the other direction. In earlier times, it was called materialistic monism because it said that matter and matter alone exists, that the world consists of nothing but bodies and their motions. Today it's come to be called the identity hypothesis, and in the process completely misusing the term identity. I think that there's a better moderate view that lies between these two erroneous extremes. It holds that brain and mind are existentially inseparable. At the same time, brain and mind can be analytically distinct. In other words, the brain is a necessary but not sufficient explanation of the human intellect. Why have the trans activists made such rookie intellectual errors? I'm not really sure, but I have two possible reasons. First, maybe the extremist nature of their claims left them with dualism as the only fig leaf available to them. Second, it may be because only psychophysical dualism provided a way to claim that transgenderism is entirely normal rather than a pathology resulting from some physical or mental defect calling for medical intervention of some kind. Recall that only a couple of years ago this phenomenon was viewed by the healing professions as requiring care. Finally, the trans activists embracing psychophysical dualism presents the activists with yet another major embarrassment as to another incontrovertible fact. Psychological studies have revealed that when young children exhibit transgender behavior, that approximately about 80% of those children eventually abandon such behavior and harmonize their behavior by polarizing around their birth sex as their bodies in the bodily sense. If the activists are correct in asserting psychophysical dualism, then this harmonization shouldn't happen. Indeed, it would be impossible if the extended substance and the thinking substance were as utterly different and unconnected as the activists assert. These substances could never interact with one another as they clearly appear to do. What happens with children as they mature suggests to me nothing so much as what we see happen in every human from time to time. We know that stress or disorder triggers a natural adaptive response as we try to adapt to the disorder by properly ordering that stress. A simple example, you go to the gym where you lift heavy weights. The adaptive response by the body is increased strength to eliminate future stress. And I think that may be what's happening here, despite what the trans activists say. I think that psychophysical dualism is utterly incompatible with the psychological studies that I just mentioned. Those studies also suggest that humans, being a complex unity, resist the so-called gender fluidity that the activists support. Um, and all of this makes me think that there's never anything new in philosophy. That's why all we ever see in modern times, it seems, or so much of the time, is the repetition of old errors with little or no awareness by the person asserting them. Thanks for listening.